Welcome to Sonar Shock, a Soviet-flavored Eldritch Horror FPS-RPG point-and-click dungeon crawler mouthful hybrid. It's an incredibly unique game, and trying to summarize everything it does in one sentence is doing it a vague injustice. It's one of my favorite games in recent memory, and while it certainly has some caveats, it has a lot of flavor, much like salmiakki. While Sonar Shock has gone under the sonar for the most part, it has attracted a niche audience among the immersive sim community, though I'll have to come back to that later. It is a staggeringly rare breed of game for me because it's one of the first times since playing Prey 2017 where I've immediately started multiple new playthroughs after initially beating the game. Coming from someone who tends to be very one and done with games, even if they have like New Game Plus or bonus features, that's extremely high praise. Now, if its title didn't give it away already, Sonar Shock is blatantly inspired by the System Shock franchise, with a little bit of the first two Bioshocks in there as well, I suppose. It may as well be wearing System Shock 1 in particular as a fursuit. I won't discuss System Shock at length because it's not the primary subject of the video, but the original is a personal favorite game of mine and one I come back to fairly regularly for a replay. Even though it hasn't had the same thriving community as titles such as Doom, it's arguably the most important and influential game ever made. The amount of titles and franchises that can trace the roots straight back to it is hard to comprehend, and a little beyond the scope of this video. Sonar Shock is a clear testament to System Shock still inspiring new games 3 decades down the line. Beyond surface level similarities such as the mix of survival and action horror elements, Sonar Shock is notable for following many of the less traveled roads of System Shock 1. The point and click mechanics, the real-time menus integrated into your HUD, and the weapon handling are the most obvious examples. This is probably one of the most 90s games to come out in the 20s, so that's your heads up that this plays a lot differently than most modern releases. Since this game came out in 2024, there's no need to download a third-party patch to get it running, and it should be easy to obtain. You can snatch it on Steam for a reasonable 8 Earthbucks. It's a bit light on graphical configuration options, but everything else I wanted was here. Otherwise, for the most part, Sonar Shock runs out of box better than Splinter Cell Conviction. For the most part. This could date the video, but it has to be mentioned now. As of writing, Sonar Shock is the most buggy game I've played for this channel that doesn't require DOSBox and is an Underworld Ascendant. The most significant issue is frame rate drops, which will appear in my footage sporadically. Sorry about that, not much I can do because it's not clear what the cause is. Fumbling around in the settings didn't fix it on my end, and that's all I know how to do. Throughout the development of this video, it takes me ages to make these longer videos, multiple hotfixes and a beta build have been released to help alleviate the frame rate drops. While I think things have gotten slightly better with these patches, the performance issues are still present. Nearby particle effects and groups of enemies still seem to be a bit too HD for the engine to handle. So as of adding this final insert, being in danger still has a decent chance of causing you to get stuck in the low frame rate jello you get stuck in while you're being chased in a dream. I have seen other bugs, such as flamethrower ammo disappearing, being shot through walls, temporarily getting stuck on vents, and movable objects resetting between saves. I encountered no major save ruining bugs or softlocks throughout my playtime, so most of these are just uncommon inconveniences thankfully. Still, it's a sign this game needs an extra coat of polish. I do consider unrefinement to be part of a game's unique experience, but these technical issues do push the boundaries of what I deem acceptable. That's a nasty line to cross. Were I someone who ranked games on an out of 10 star scale, this would take away at least an entire star. Owing to my strange personal style of assessing games, these technical issues do not affect my recommendation much, but I sincerely hope a future patch can smoothen out the frame rate issues for good. It was the single greatest source of agitation throughout my entire experience with Sonar Shock. No doubt impressive considering its sanity mechanics. Boy, do I have a lot to say about that. We'll get to that later. All that aside, I'm going to briefly discuss the premise and writing, though I aim to avoid spoilers so you could experience most of it blind. I'm not one to talk much about story, so this will be more of a summary than anything else. Sonar Shock takes place on board a USSR submarine known as the S-1 Utopia. It's the largest nuclear submarine ever built, even including a museum in the Maw of Chaos, and you were specially selected for its maiden voyage. But uh-oh, something has gone horribly awry. Strange monsters have appeared on board, many of the seamen have gone nuts, and the Admiral allegedly wants to scuttle the ship. It's up to you, Ivan Amnesiac, to figure out what is happening on board the ship and fight off the Eldritch monster menace. That's not a spoiler, the game says they're eldritch on the store page, which I always thought kind of defeated the point of H.P. Lovecraft-inspired media, but whatever. It's otherwise a mysterious conflict amongst the crew that you gradually unravel as you play, with the strangeness escalating as you learn more. I do think it's a bit backloaded with its most interesting ideas and developments, all of which I wish got a little more screen time. Still, it's overall a fairly straightforward story with simple objectives and a decent amount of lore conveyed through dialogue and notes. I like the atmosphere the story adds and the bits it leaves up to interpretation, with its primary weak points being its characters and tone. The characters are just one note and rather forgettable, but the tone is something I really need to talk about. Sonar Shock is presented as survival horror on a Russian submarine in a fairly grounded setting. In moment-to-moment gameplay, it sells its tone well. Resources are limited, every other room is in disarray with signs of struggles, and many enemies are former sailors who have succumbed to madness and are now silently waiting in ambush. The few people you can talk to are fighting to survive, losing their minds, speculating on what these beasts are, and Sherlock Holmes and Watson have a side quest for you to find out who stole a magic sword from the museum. Don't they know that the museum is haunted? One of the very first things you see in the game is a burger named Borger. Just want to say that I feel a burger shouldn't heal someone affiliated with the USSR. Later on, you're battling your way through an infested temple full of grisly scenes and unknowable monsters, and find a note saying sewer count +1 on the ground. One of the main characters almost feels like a poorly translated comedy bit, and it's even acknowledged by the player character. Sonar Shock doesn't have too many of these goofy moments, it's just that when they do show up, something about them really takes me out of the world. It's odd, because I genuinely think there's above average horror elements here, but when I blast a big invincible monster with a fire extinguisher and it starts playing that Looney Tunes Dizzy Stars sound effect, it creates a disconnect. Balancing comedy with horror is extremely difficult, and I think the comedy just stands out way too much for it to really work here. The silliness in the wrong places contrasts too much against the good horror in the right places. It's a fine line that was walked like a coarse circle, though it's at least a small part of the game and not horrific enough to greatly affect my overall opinion. Speaking of silliness, let's divert course and talk a little bit about crossbreeding the perfect clown. Being Ivan Amnesiac, you're a blank slate with a good few options for your background. Yep, this game has character creation. Before you've even seen the intro cutscene, you're already ambushed with a slightly obtuse stat selection that doesn't give you numeric information nor gameplay context to draw from. Not a big fan, but it's kinda par for RPGs as a whole. It's one of the reasons why even softcore RPGs really need to do a lot right to retain my interest. On the bright side, you are given decent written suggestions of what each skill does, so there's not too much confusion to be had. Character creation is fairly streamlined in Sonar Shock, asking you to pick from 3 groups of 4 passive perks. These perks not only provide immediate bonuses to your stats, but can also grant you both unique passive abilities and a nationality. No, really, there's a bunch of achievements for starting as different nationalities. From experience, I feel that games like this often turn out to be balancing nightmares, blatantly favoring specific playstyles and casting certain stats far to the side. System Shock 2 was a major inspiration for Sonar Shock, and as someone who's beaten that game on Impossible as a side character, I can firmly say that calling this balancing a traffic accident is a horrific over-exaggeration of traffic accidents. Well, contrary to expectations, I'd actually say that Sonar Shock is well balanced with almost no bad build paths. Stat points are very precious, you only get what you start with in between 10 to 20 more depending on how thoroughly you explore. However, almost every skill is a worthwhile investment owing to their versatility. You really can't make a build that's doomed from the beginning. It's fairly easy to divert course early on, though many of the passives can make a massive difference and help focus your build. Hailing from Kazakhstan effectively doubles ammo pickups, being a cannibal makes you a cannibal, being Russian lets you fist enemies until they see stars, and being a doctor lets you know exactly how much health you have. Yeah, that's a mechanic, the game obfuscates your numeric health value by default. You always have colored visual cues down here that give you a rough gauge of your health. Still, this is just a taste of some of the spicy experimental design to come. Anyway, since this system is clearly rather minimalist, I won't bog this video down too much with build advice. My personal recommendation might be Free Stuff, Shamashko, and Redacted. Shamashko, I can't be bothered to check the pronunciation, can be interchanged with Checkmate since +2 hacking is nice early on. This build doesn't distribute the most skill points, but it's flexible and it maximizes your access to ammo and health, which would be great on the first playthrough. It doesn't have a weapon specialty by default, so you'll have to pick that one yourself. Don't feel blindly compelled to mimic that build, because as long as you think a little and don't do game journalist stuff, such as not investing in combat skills, you'll be fine. My first playthrough was as a melee build, which is a shockingly viable path, though I would suggest supplementing it with light or heavy firearms. The only real skill trap in a game roughly pertains to this. Sonar Shock has a quirky, unintuitive 2-weapon limit. You can't carry a heavy firearm and a light firearm at the same time, nor a small weapon and a melee weapon at the same time. You can carry a wrench and a rifle, but not a wrench and a pistol, or a shotgun and a rifle. Here's a horrific visual I threw together in a couple minutes that hopefully conveys how this quirk works. The game doesn't give you any hint that this is a thing in character creation. The fact that this is really the only major character creation trap is a testament to Sonar Shock being more refined and smart with its skill design than average. Despite that, it's certainly not perfect. Strength is so versatile that it's hard to not put a few points towards it. Faith is literally completely useless on certain playthroughs. Agility is arguably the dump stat. Luck seems good, but it's hard to measure its usefulness, and hacking has diminishing returns. Still, the balancing is good enough that I was able to complete the game on the hardest difficulty of 3 wildly different builds, all 3 of which had noticeable specialties, situations where they excelled, and moments where I felt like I was missing out on advantages my other playthroughs had. For instance, putting no points into hacking is viable, but even though it's primarily utility, I somehow felt more vulnerable without any points in it. However, that playthrough had access to hard-hitting long-range rifles and a most efficient light source in the game, which both gave me significant edges in places over my buff Slayer hacker. Feeling these differences is a sign of solid character building, so thumbs up for doing well where so many other games have fumbled. Sonar Shock ultimately does surprisingly well with its character building and creation, being fairly minimalist while still incentivizing players to choose their skills wisely. There's enough wiggle room for goofier builds, but far from enough to become a master of everything. I think that's a happy middle ground to occupy, so I'm happy with the character building overall. It sure squeezed a decent handful of replays out of me. Good stuff. Once you're out of character creation, you're thrust right into the obligate tutorial pipe maze. You've hit your head hard. Thankfully, your buddy down the hall made sure to leave sticky notes to remind you how to walk and turn. Good on him. The first few minutes of the game let you quietly wander around and get a feel for the menus, looting, and controls, and thus a lot of the gameplay loop. Here, you fight what some may consider to be Sonar Shock's hardest boss, the controls. There's something that I could imagine being a turn-off, turning incidentally being something your character has more trouble with than the average toddler. Yep, there's tank controls. I suppose it's appropriate for a game where you control a Russian soldier. Tank controls are present because you can't look around with a mouse, unlike just about any other first-person game made in the past 2 decades. You can't even look up or down because your character has a very extreme case of 90s FPS protagonist neck syndrome. Couple that with your inability to jump and get past barely shin-high obstacles and you have a vertically restrictive game. It's an interesting shift in comparison to System Shock, which gave you jet boots. Despite that, it all works just fine for Sonar Shock's purposes. Here, your character being vertically challenged is considered in the level design and the gameplay, and it doesn't stick out too often outside of specific scenarios. I can live without vertical mouse look, but tank controls are usually much more of a sore spot for me. Well, Sonar Shock doesn't ask much in the way of movement. Enemy AI and attacks are simple, and even gunmen will charge you down, falling for the old British urchin round the corner beatdown technique. And even though it's clunky, you can still pull off some cute little bits of finesse like ducking under projectiles. I honestly expected this game to have massive projectile hitboxes, but nope, it's generous in a fun way. How quaint. The quirks of piloting Ivan Amnesiac don't stop there. One of Sonar Shock's most immediate features, and one of the things that grabbed my attention, is the way its HUD functions. The primary deviation from the modern norm is the fact that your mouse is constantly unlocked, a bit like a point and click. You use this to both aim and do all your menuing in real time in the bottom left chunk of the screen. This little collection of tabs is how you access your objectives, inventory, weapon menu, skill points, and so forth. It's a streamlining of the original System Shock's HUD, ditching a lot of superfluous elements, awkwardness, and information overload. The most significant loss here is the fact that you can't have a second tab window in the bottom right, though I think that's fine since Sonar Shock wants to put more emphasis on managing your tabs well. After all, even though System Shock lets you whip out healing at just about any time, Sonar Shock asks that you switch to your inventory tab and find it. You may need to swap from your weapon to your inventory and back to your weapon in the heat of battle, and that's just a tab switching alone, not even mentioning what you might need to quickly do in each of those tabs. It's another way that Sonar Shock puts pressure on the player and encourages mastering its clunky, if charming, design. I should note that a streamlined system isn't inherently a superior one. System Shock's HUD is a catastrophe at first glance, but is completely learnable and gives you access to everything you need at a moment's notice. Constant immediate access to your weapons, ammo, healing, consumables, and abilities fits its punishing, action-oriented design. Sonar Shock's HUD is clunk in its own ways, being slimmed down and primed for a slower paced campaign with fewer tools at the player's disposal and less intensive combat. Different strokes for different shocks. That does lead me to another comparison. The interesting thing about this mix of tank controls and the unlocked mouse is that it's arguably antiquated in comparison to System Shock 1. Unlike Sonar Shock, System Shock 1's standard movement allows for strafing in addition to locking the crosshair in the center of the screen. You had to hit a button to toggle between the freed point-and-click mouse and standard movement, symbolizing a clear division between interaction in both combat and navigation. Sonar Shock not having such a divide and instead substituting tank controls could be a bad, archaic design choice to some. I do think System Shock is superior here, though I view Sonar Shock's prime USDA clunk as being done in reverence of old horror games. I will say that this choice could have been enhanced by integrating the point-and-click mechanics into the game more deeply. Beyond pianos, secrets hidden behind bookshelves, and its gun handling, Sonar Shock doesn't utilize the way it controls as interestingly as it could have. Regardless, this is clearly a niche game targeting an audience of people who are fine with a mix of older and experimental design methodologies. I mean, you're not even given a numeric health indicator by default for Pete's sake. Sonar Shock's gameplay was obviously built around its unconventional controls and design choices, so almost none of its clunk feels like a slapped-on artificial difficulty multiplier. It all mixes together to add tension and vulnerability to the experience, so if it feels like you need to keep your head on a swivel, it's because it kind of is in a literal sense. Speaking of swiveling guns around, using guns especially heavily involves the point-and-click mechanics. Beyond the obvious you point and click with your gun, you need to use the weapon menu to replace mags, change firing modes, and operate slides, bolts, levers, and hammers. Different weapons are simulated differently, with a revolver being way more involved than your average mag-fed machine gun. Almost. Every weapon in the game has a secondary firing mode as well, ranging from mundane things like a scope to hot things like transforming buckshot into dragon's breath rounds. Be careful, questioning that will drain your sanity. You may choose your weapon because it's easy to use, or stick with one because the extra dangerous handling puts you in is well worth the reward. I particularly love the Nagant 1936, which hits like a truck packed with many smaller trucks for extra weight but requires you to fan the hammer and reload each bullet individually. I love this because it adds a layer of human error to gunfights that most other shooters can't simulate. Overall, this may be the most involved and intense weapon reloading I've seen outside of VR games or Receiver. While it's not the most advanced or realistic thing ever, I mean, you can pull back the slide before actually sticking the new magazine in and it'll still load as if you did it in the correct order. It adds so much to the combat. It gives a lot of identity and tactility to these guns that don't even have proper first-person sprites. It's cool, and it's the primary thing I've shown to my friends to bring this game to their attention. It's such a great natural evolution from the comparatively minimalist implementation of this present in the original System Shock. Beyond the gimmicks of weapon handling, Sonar Shock's arsenal should be fairly familiar to first-person shooter veterans, potentially in more ways than one. Most of these are grounded, late Soviet-era firearms that shoot straight. They're all seemingly based on real firearms, with a decent handful of them being relatively obscure. People who tuck their AR-15s to bed at night might enjoy the range of weapons represented here, in addition to the interesting liberties that have been taken with the names of a few guns. The Piotr 63, for example, is a mild remix of the PM63. The name of the PM63's designer? Piotr will not bother pronouncing his name. So while these guns end up being fairly standard FPS fare, they largely compensate by feeling pretty good to use. They sound decent, hit surprisingly hard, and are given a lot of individual identity by the reloading and firing mode mechanics. All four weapon categories, melee, small arms, light arms, and heavy arms, are viable. The weapon classes are mostly evenly matched, though one is an awkward fit, and I'll get into that later. Otherwise, there's no weapon skill that's obviously far better or worse than the others. Since Sonar Shock is an RPG of sorts, weapons are usually only especially good if you put a few points into their respective skill. They only affect damage, so it's not like Deus Ex. A weapon with the baseline accuracy of a Daily Mail article will always struggle to hit a barn-sized Shoggoth. Weapons also have minimum stat requirements, resulting in that RPG dilemma where your character understands how to use a plasma cutter, but not how to use an axe or a rifle. Classic pistol user moment. The variety in the weapons is decent, though weapons in the same subcategory can be mildly different flavors of the same thing, especially regarding pistols and SMGs. SMGs incidentally being the worst weapon class, though they still can unleash some ammo inefficient pain once per mag dump. Other weapon types fare considerably better, with shotguns and some of the heavier rifles and pistols having great bite to them. Shotguns, which share the same weapon class as SMGs for some reason, have incredible stopping power here. I am not at all dissatisfied with these shotguns. Bonus star and a half on the hypothetical star rating for this. Most guns are otherwise decent, though I do have to give a special mention to the subpar flamethrower. It does a lot of damage, sure, but it burns through ammo faster than it burns through semen. I love that it looks like I'm shooting bubbles more so than flames, and that picking up another weapon in the same slot deletes all ammo into flamethrower's mag. That's cool. Hot. Bomb. So, now we're starting at a good flamethrower tally. Not like it'll survive the next game I want to cover in my long format anyways. This is so sad. Can we get 50 likes for video game flamethrowers? So while that is unfortunate, I do appreciate that it's an option, since fuel cells are not used by many weapons anyways. You are throwing away ammo for the endgame grenade launcher by using a flamethrower though. I think that's the real downside here. Overall, the variety in the arsenal is above average. Heavy weapons, which probably is ultimately the most varied weapon class, features a flamethrower, a sniper rifle, and a harpoon gun, just to name a select few options. 3 of the 4 weapon classes have at least 5 weapons to choose from, melee being the sole exception at 3. All of that is on top of there being a handful of one-of-a-kind weapons that encourage you to keep your eyes peeled. Such fancy gadgets are far from necessary to turn loopy sailors into goopy sailors, and you can main early game weapons for a decent chunk of the campaign. While you may unlock access to new weapons as you invest more points in a skill, earlier weapons will become more powerful as well. Beyond that, you get a lot of fun, rather overpowered toys to play with as you enter the final act. Want to go ham with a grenade launcher? Hope you saved up on microchips and fuel cells. It's definitely worth it for the novelty of rampaging with a grenade launcher in an otherwise reserved game. Perhaps guns don't quite scratch the itch. Well, you can pick up fire extinguishers, explosive barrels, or boxes and throw them. With enough strength investment, you can one-box a lot of enemies, though explosives don't care how muscular your arms are. This adds a mild brawler element to the combat that I am quite fond of. It's a dependable way to squeeze out an edge in fights, and I would sometimes start a fight with a fire extinguisher just for the fun of it. Speaking of brawling, I haven't really discussed melee. Melee has a little complexity beyond light attacks and heavy attacks, yet I believe it is the largest wrench in the balancing, which is appropriate because even a starting wrench can twist nuts well. I haven't talked much about this up to this point, but ammo is limited in Sonar Shock. Unless you hail from Kazakhstan, 3 of the 4 ammo types are in such short supply that you may not find many more than 100 bullets throughout your entire playthrough. Given how theoretically limited that means ammo can be, it feels odd that melee weapons are both very powerful and completely free of any form of upkeep or resource cost. There's a large number of little design quirks that push melee hard. Melee weapons are governed by strength, a versatile skill that also grants you significant boosts to both your max health and the damage you deal with thrown objects. The usual downside to melee weapons, their short range, is negated by the fact that Sonar Shock's enemies universally charge you down, allowing you to easily ambush them from around a corner. Very few enemies counteract melee in meaningful ways. There are these guys that explode on death, but they spawn unpredictably and are very hard to distinguish from a far less dangerous common enemy. So that's a counterbalance, a cheap shot. Great. There's another enemy type that can't be taken on in close-range melee, but a little bit of inventiveness in the sword can easily bypass that issue. Speaking of which, I feel the unique melee weapon, the Clarinet Sword, is the cherry on top of this. It has decent stats on top of being able to fire out a projectile on charged attacks. It does take a moment to charge that projectile up, though it still does some great damage. It'll 3-shot the most dangerous enemies in the game. This is made even more ridiculous by how quickly you can acquire it. I tried a couple speedruns out of curiosity, and managed chance to snatch it within 3 minutes and 35 seconds of starting a new save. That's with very little optimization beyond just finding a route. You're normally supposed to solve Sherlock's haunted Scooby-Doo museum puzzle for it, except you can brute force the quest without any consequences, and your ability to remember the code isn't exactly something that poofs away between playthroughs. Regardless of how easy it is to acquire, a hard-hitting infinite durability melee weapon with a free ranged attack is an awkward fit into a fairly slow-paced game like Sonar Shock. System Shock famously has the laser rapier, that incredible beatdown stick that beat a love of first-person beatdowns into me. The caveat there is that System Shock is an action-focused game, at least relative to Sonar Shock. It features greater resource availability, more tools at the player's disposal, and harder encounters, and the laser rapier slowly consumes a precious multi-purpose resource in the form of power. Even if the remake felt the need to indirectly nerf it, the laser rapier has its place and doesn't replace the need for guns. That's exactly what the clarinet sword in Sonar Shock does. Of course, you can skip out on it, and if you don't invest in strength or prefer pistols, you can't use it anyways. More than anything else, I'm just warning people who haven't played this game that using this thing will turn your playthrough into an avant-garde Soviet Halloween roller coaster ride. It's easy to get clad in a net of the clarinet, so use it at your own risk. There's only 3 melee weapons anyways, this thing, the starting wrench, and the axe. The axe is an endgame weapon, and while it doesn't act like it's imported from Terraria, it does compensate by consistently one-shotting almost everything. To be fair, endgame guns are good at one-shotting too, so I guess melee and guns even out in the last 30 minutes of the game. Despite going on about this for a little bit, I do want to make it clear that melee isn't necessarily severely overpowered. I do appreciate melee being a viable playstyle. Being able to curb stomp gunmen with a wrench is a video gaming novelty I personally won't ever get sick of. More than anything else, I actually think melee is counteracted by the fact it causes you to miss out on multiple interesting aspects of the game. Mostly in relation to the guns. Like I've said, the need to operate weapons with your mouse gives them a lot of charisma and adds a lot of tension. Resource management, while not a huge problem in Sonar Shock, also helps guns feel more engaging and thoughtful. This is intended to be a survival horror game after all. It's marketed as such, though I do have some choice words on that in a bit. Regardless, it means melee slots in incredibly awkwardly, stripping a lot of resource management, variety, and unpredictability out of the experience. Meaning melee gets stale way faster into guns. It's why I loosely suggested going for a guns playthrough instead of a melee playthrough much earlier. A playthrough heavily involving guns and managing them is far more varied and interesting than spending the bulk of the game huddling around corners with a beatdown stick. If you want a fun and relatively thought out melee experience with Russian undertones, perhaps The Hunt would be more your speed. That game's a janky Condemned clone, it's hard to not respect that. As for Sonar Shock, I just got a lot more joy out of shooting monsters or lighting them on fire with my mind. They called it pyrochromia, I think. Or maybe it was heterokinesis, I don't know. Anyways, it's time to abruptly bring up the fact that they're psychic powers. You might have seen it coming though, what with YouTube's chapters and all. These are tied to your faith statistic and are powered by Sanity. Sanity is effectively your mana, though there's more to that I'll discuss shortly. The psychic powers are relatively few in number, 8 in total, though they each have their own gimmick and theoretical uses. Emphasis on theoretical. You've got pyrokinesis, healing, sailor juice slurping, keypad proselytization, a Soviet ghost summon, throwable mines made of snot, flying bells that waste your sanity, and mark and recall but in a game where it's totally useless. The kit has decent variety at its core, with some powers focusing on utility or support and others focusing on combat, though they all tend to run a gargantuan gamut in terms of usefulness. I'll elaborate on that as I go through this section, because this is probably the worst section I've ever written for a video, and just editing it at this point is draining my sanity. Anyways, on the bright side, what's good here is really good. Speaking of bright things, pyrokinesis, referred to as combustion in-game, is one of, if not the most efficient sources of ranged damage present. It's able to one-shot most enemies at high faith levels, though the DOT will need to run its course. That does take a while. Fire and forget, quite literally. As a bonus, it's able to be used as an infinite free-of-cost light source. It doesn't deduct your sanity at all if it doesn't hit an enemy. All other light sources have some sort of penalty. You can carry an explosive barrel around for light, sure, but that does slow you down. You know, I felt clever for realizing that that's a thing you can do. Regardless, combustion's extremely efficient long-range damage output and ability to light dark areas for free both make it extremely useful in and out of combat. Unfortunately, I think the powers are mostly downhill from here. While most other powers aren't as versatile, they do still have their moments where they shine. I had a good bit of fun toying around with the snot mine, sucking sailors dry is pretty great, and the Soviet Shadow Man is an amusing sleeping giant of a power, figuratively and literally. If you gamble correctly and summon the Shadow while its AI isn't hibernating, he will almost immediately trounce everything nearby in less than a second. It's pretty hilarious, and I only wish he were a sexy hedgehog. All impure thoughts aside, psi powers use one of the most limited resources in the game, Sanity. You can choose to be a Christian in character creation to offset that, but the average player probably won't pick that because how are you supposed to interpret this blind? Anyways, whether you're a Christian submarine wizard or not, Sanity is a precious resource. Sanity is not only drained by casting powers, it's also deducted when you are hit by certain enemies or when you witness scripted events throughout the world. Some ways the game drains sanity are unavoidable and or random, so that's a maddening quirk to look out for. These red soldiers are especially frustrating since they randomly decide to deal completely unavoidable sanity damage to you when they transform. I really hate that. Anyways, you want to keep sanity high because once it's low enough, you start hallucinating and experiencing detrimental events, becoming more detrimental as your sanity plunges lower. Unique enemies appearing, HUD elements malfunctioning, taking guaranteed health damage, of course, and seeing shadow demons are just a few potential events. There are a lot of hallucinations, and a handful of them caught me off guard hard. The sheer number of different sanity-related events, in addition to how dangerous they can be, make maintaining sanity and surviving on low sanity an engaging affair. I mean, you don't want your guns to repeatedly jam in the middle of a big battle, right? That ain't good for you or your gun's health. Your primary way to avoid Cthulhu mentally jamming your guns is pills and cigarettes, which are hard to come by, so they need to be conserved. Sanity management ended up keeping me on edge more than health management in my first playthrough, mostly because of that scarcity. On a funny note, Sonar Shock may be the only game I've ever played to make smoking worth it. I've always wondered if developers are scared that giving players even the vaguest reason to smoke cigarettes would come across as industry propaganda, only to then make alcohol heal you. I don't know, I find it kinda funny. Here, you regain a decent amount of sanity relative to health lost, so hey, of all games to feature smokes that clutter up my inventory, Sonar Shock has the best by far. Smoking too much does vaporize you though, there's an achievement for it, so it's not full-on industry propaganda. It's pretty realistic in this regard. Returning back to the powers, while they can be incredibly strong, decent investment into faith is almost mandatory. Many of them have a harsh minimum requirement and can be horrifically inefficient at lower levels. The first power asks for a minimum faith of 2, so no agnostic is going to have an infinite source of light. 2 faith isn't a massive investment, but not every player may be willing to spare those precious perk points on the most abstract skill on offer. This isn't a massive ordeal given obvious RPG stylings of Sonar Shock, but it does send a strange mixed message when a major game mechanic left out in the open that's bound to the middle mouse button and features a unique resource tied to it is one of the least accessible mechanics going. Plus, among the 7 unique powers, only combustion is multi-purpose, with everything else having a very specific designated utility or combat use. It means your power roster is not very flexible. Statistically, I think a side playthrough will end up sticking to combustion and to hacking power because everything else either has uncommon use cases or provides something that is better acquired through other means. And given the abstract nature of sanity, the rarity of items that heal it, and how the game can arbitrarily drain it, I found myself psychologically pushed away from psi powers in general. Like I said, many of them are at least decent at what they're supposed to do at the max faith level, even if they rarely saw use. Since faith reduces all sanity damage, a high faith build is all about milking a lot more out of madness. Your powers get stronger and their casting costs become cheaper, greatly encouraging any build aiming to use these powers to max it out before you even find combustion, which is found on level 2 by the way, psi powers aren't even present before then. This results in an interesting dichotomy where a character who uses insanity-inducing powers, at least sparingly, will have far less trouble with sanity than a character who does not. Since faith reduces all sanity penalties, the heftiest jump scare the average Soviet has ever seen is more like lightly stubbing your toe to a Slavic sub-psyker. Speaking of which, if you're at low sanity, brace for the actual literal jump scares. The scariest part is a smug winky face you get afterwards. Thanks Cthulhu. Love you too. Regardless, both the abstraction of sanity as a resource and how it can be arbitrarily deducted makes the mileage of faith hard to quantify. It's another factor that makes faith the most awkward playstyle on offer. It feels like even the best aspects of it have abstractions or inconveniences buried within. Combustion may be the most resource efficient form of ranged damage present, yet even that has its bad quirks. Combustion not only has an initial casting delay, but it also does most of its damage over time. Enemies on fire will also charge you down, dealing some of the heaviest hitting melee attacks in the game if they get close. Must be what agility is for, huh? Admittedly, this is a clinical way of looking at things, but a shotgun doesn't have this problem. It's easier to understand a shotgun and how far each shell will go than how far one use of combustion will go. A shotgun also doesn't light enemies on fire and cause them to speedily chase you. Well, the endgame shotgun can, but you catch my drift. Compounding all of that, among the 8 unique powers, only a couple are multi-purpose. Most powers are effectively round pegs that only go into round holes, like me. This is usually something I wouldn't take massive issue with, but remember, a lot of people pass Sonar Shock off as an immersive sim. As such, I think a very restrictive roster of powers is a genuine issue worth bringing up. I've already gone over the versatility of combustion, so the only other power you can do anything especially interesting with is the snot mines. This power allows you to summon throwable manure-shaped fire extinguishers that detonate with enemy proximity. I had some great moments with this power since it's the only explosive weapon that isn't the endgame grenade launcher. These snot mines occupy a great spot in the roster, to the point that bombarding enemies with snot was one of my favorite parts of my Orthodox Christian playthrough. So beyond combustion and the mines, none of the other 6 powers offers much in the way of player inventiveness and or utility. They tend to do relatively little, being specialized for situations that don't come up often, if at all. The hacking power has no use outside of keypads, and the bell has no use outside of situations where enemies enter the exceedingly rare traffic jam formation. The bell especially is utterly hilarious to me. This endgame power is built upon the idea that you shoot the bell to create an explosion. Problem is, the explosion is small in radius, the bell can only be awkwardly shot straight ahead after a delay, and its hitbox is massive. So it'll likely just hit a wall close to you or get absorbed by an enemy the instant you cast it. This is supposed to be the hidden endgame power? It's a bit embarrassing. I really think the powers need a second glance in general. Some could use buffs, some could use more purpose. I'm already dragging out my discussion of Sanity and Faith a lot, so I don't want to list off a bunch of ideas, but little additions like the bell distracting enemies or the hacking power turning certain enemies against each other could do a lot to spice up the roster. I felt there was a lot of immersive sim potential with the powers, but they mostly felt like they could be magic spells from any random dungeon crawler. This missing potential isn't a huge blemish on the game overall, but it does tie into how it could betray player expectations in a bad way. I'll elaborate on that idea more in the later genre confusion section. For now, I just want to point to Faith and the powers attached to it as one of the major reasons why the game shouldn't be marketed to newcomers as an immersive sim. So even though they are objectively not bad, side powers overall strike me as being supplemental to everything else, almost like they are a late addition to the game. It makes them feel rather odd and aimless relative to most of the other skills. It also makes the punishments that come with Sanity a little off-putting since many builds may not get much out of it in return. It's 5 Faith or bust. Now, I'm going to ambush you with something important. Sanity only appears when you pick up your first psi power. If you never pick up a psi power, you'll never have to deal with Sanity. Yeah, I genuinely wondered if this was a severe bug or an oversight, only to then see the developer state that it's intentional. I feel this is very bizarre design, a band-aid solution to Sanity effectively saddling non-psi players with a layer of resource management that doesn't come with an upside. The average Joe is likely too curious to pass up the psi powers, but by the time they realize they need to put more points into Faith, they're already stuck with the burden of Sanity. I'm sure some of you can relate. Even knowing you're intended to be able to ignore it, I still feel like I'm cheating the game by doing this. I think Sanity should have some universal upsides, like perhaps stat bonuses for keeping it high, or some more low-level spells to give players a small taste of submarine magic. Despite all that, I do really like the experience of Sanity overall, since it's a memorably flawed yet unique system. My side playthrough was fun and highly experimental, yet I found Sanity itself more interesting than the powers tied to it, and would love to see expansion on it or more similar games with such a system. It's cool, memorable stuff, and a great advertising point for Sonar Shock, for sure.
I can take it.
I want to take a brief detour from gameplay to talk about presentation, since I never really know where to put this section in these videos anyways. Sonar Shock does have a fairly unique visual style. I enjoyed a mid-90s-esque mix of 2D and very low poly 3D, in addition to these low fidelity, slightly blown out textures. There's a subtle surreal vibe to the world from the ambiguity, and the walls that look like Jackson Pollock paintings if they were good. I like the surreality. It's hard to describe, but it feels like a fairly natural surreality, one that stems from slightly dreamy takes on places that seem grounded at a glance. You know, this game was considered for one of my surreal game compilations, but I had too much to say. Regardless, I do like Sonar Shock's world and art direction. It's a Soviet submarine, leaning harder into the Soviet part. There's a decent spoonful of low-res Soviet aesthetics here, and they're flavorful enough. However, I do wish the submarine part of the presentation was leaned into more, because it's pretty easy to forget about it. Being trapped in a giant metal tube deep in the ocean is a pretty horrifying concept. Not leaning into that is a big mistake. See, Sonar Shock doesn't let you see any sea until it's about to seize, so it seems as far as my seeing eyes shall see, it only sells the shell of the Seaman a sea fantasy. In less tongue-twisting terms, a lot of the environments could just be any other underground base or industrial space station from any other game. On the other hand, I guess most of the game is as utilitarian and corridorous as you'd expect a submarine to be. It's on the claustrophobic side of things, but it does open up from time to time, and it thankfully realizes that the more open areas should still have a sense of danger to them. Beyond the elevator, nowhere in this game is really safe. Still, industrial corridors are a fairly consistent feature of Sonar Shock on top of being a horrible band name. Thankfully, Sonar Shock doesn't get bogged down purely in industrial corridors. Each floor features its own color palette, theme, and architecture. The color scheme can be a seemingly dull mix of grays and browns, though this helps keep the setting grounded and makes the greens and blues at the latter half of the game stick out much more. I'm also quite fond of how the limited, very low poly 3D models are used. The developer clearly had fun at the limitations, especially in places like the museum. Set pieces like the museum and the totally not Thief-inspired Artemis Park really help distinguish their respective decks. Even so, the recreation deck in particular is very weird because it feels like an outdoor environment rather than something on a submarine. Maybe it's part of the point, but it does feel a little divorced from the rest of the world's reality. Not to say I dislike it, just to say it sticks out. That aside, I don't think Sonar Shock is a perfect imitation of old graphics, but it's a flattering imitation featuring a sprinkle of modern flair, especially in the particle effects and lighting departments. Particle effects are quite chunky and a bit excessive in a good way, especially if you invest in luck and frequently land those goofy, gory, slow-mo critical hits. Yeah, that's what that slow-mo has been. They're a nice chunk to complement the clunk, and they lend a decent sense of weight to weapons, or at least critical hits. There's not too many particle effects overall, and half of them you'll see are from stepping on enough ambient crabs to call in the world's first Sonar Shock tactical nuke. Still, I think the particle effects are fun and fit the 90s vibe of the game surprisingly well. Lighting is a more obvious, consistently modern aspect of the visuals, coming in numerous different colors and casting fairly harsh shadows. Many areas are well lit, and a good few are near pitch dark, neither of which being any indication of how safe an area is. In general, Sonar Shock is dark. Some of the darkness is so black that the developers could probably be sued by Anish Kapoor. As a result, light sources end up feeling like a valuable resource. Combustion does feel a bit like cheating though. You can probably stumble through the darkness just fine, but the frequency of both dark areas and items hidden in dim corners result in lighting being very nice to have in general. So I like the way the lighting is handled all around. It's dark, but not like cheapo horror game dark, and you have the means to counteract it. It's a good compromise and fits the softcore survival horror flavors of Sonar Shock. There are some noteworthy miscellanea to the visuals I want to mention, with the most obvious one probably being that enemies have two different art styles. Monsters have this claymation look, and humanoids have this pixelated look. It's clearly intentional, and it's an interesting way to keep the monsters distinct, though I think it might work better in a fully 3D game. Most of the traditional pixel art enemies feel a bit generic or uninteresting, so I think this claymation aesthetic is a great contrast. Though that's not to say that the monster designs themselves are anything revolutionary. Claymation monsters in a non-claymation world is a fantastic idea, and I'd love to see other takes on such an aesthetic. I should clarify, I actually don't know for certain if these are claymation, they just give off that vibe. I think it's a reasonable conclusion, given their more detailed, slimy, shaded, slightly less pixel-arty look relative to most other sprites. By the way, I don't know how to write a transition. On the subject of originality, while Sonar Shock has a considerable number of original elements, it can be overly inspired at times. It wears its influences on its sleeve to make one of the greatest understatements I've ever made on my channel. Artemis Park is just the maw of chaos from Thief. Diffusion Cutter's literally the Dead Space Plasma Cutter, including the rotator cuff functionality. The hentai heads are almost certainly inspired by Resident Evil, and so forth. And obviously it draws inspiration from a decent few games whose titles have the word shock in them. I can be a bit absent-minded at times, so there's almost certainly more here that I didn't notice. So hey, there could still be a horror game scavenger hunt waiting for you here in Sonar Shock. I don't mind it when a game like this references its inspirations, but the sheer one-to-oneness of a lot of these really sticks out for me. It's a stark contrast to the aspects of the presentation that are unique and thus charming. It's probably just a me thing though, I don't find obvious references to be very interesting. Regardless, visually I do like most aspects of Sonar Shock's presentation. It has decent soul, and I do respect the effort to make the levels, set pieces, and certain enemies all feel distinct. I even respect the homages to an extent because they do give the game a bit of extra soul through the implication that the creator is a big fan of horror games. Even if I've been relatively light on my discussion of the visuals were the big thing that convinced me to try this game. The screenshots chosen for the store page were incredibly enticing, so props for being the first indie game on Steam to actually show off some appealing highlights. So I think Sonar Shock has a decent and fairly unique art direction. I'd love to see more of this developer's visual stylings in the future. It's got good charm for what it is, though it can feel overly reminiscent of other games sometimes, and a few of its strongest elements could have been used more effectively. Most of the things I dislike about the visuals are nitpicky or relatively subjective. It adds up to a net positive, so it's all fine. I don't have much more to say about the visuals themselves, so I'll discuss the soundscape after this Family Guy cutaway gag. This song sucks, let's change it to something good. As for the sound design, I don't have quite as much to say. It's a very serviceable soundscape. A good few of the sound effects have a stock feel to them, but they're decent picks regardless. The sounds of the UI are fairly satisfying, and I especially enjoy the save disk sound. I did come to associate it with safety, which is the kind of association you want players to make in a game like this. The combat sounds quite good, with guns being sufficiently punchy and the sounds of operating them adding a nice sense of tactility. Enemy sound effects are generally fine, though nothing to really write home about. They're subdued without being inaudible, so enemies can sometimes get to drop on you, but you can often hear them in advance. However, some enemies do silently wait in ambush, so there still manages to be a sense of potential danger around every corner. This all works well for the survival horror vibe that Sonar Shock is going for. Speaking of survival horror, the ambient soundscape is probably the highlight of the sound design. You hear indistinct industrial sounds, ominous chimes that feel like they surround you, sounds reminiscent of blowing winds, distant monster noises and breathing, and the pinging of sonar. In general, I really love how reserved and quiet Sonar Shock is on a moment-to-moment basis. There's an eerie tranquility to this soundscape. Horror games can have oddly relaxing ambience and music, and I think Sonar Shock falls into this category at times. Beyond that, I don't know if this game has much original music outside of its title theme, with the little music present either being extremely ambient or being part of the Soviet aesthetics. It's not a game that wants you to rock out while you gun down monsters, so I'm willing to accept that there isn't any catchy beat to slay eldritch horrors to. Anyways, just have a demo reel, see for yourself. Hear for yourself, actually, whatever. And that's about it for my discussion of sound design. Yeah, I went real deep into it this time. It's ultimately well-rounded all around, with nothing significant to prod at aside from maybe the Cthulhu puppies having a strangely loud and omnipresent death sound. That's a little off-putting. Regardless, the soundscape is good for what it is and serves the game well, both as a shooter and as a horror game. What more could you ask for with a game like this? It's time to move on to the level design and navigational aspects of Sonar Shock, though this section is probably going to ultimately be more like a grab bag of gameplay elements I haven't really addressed yet. Sonar Shock is a highly traversable game. That comment may seem like it comes out of nowhere, but you know, remember Citadel. Sonar Shock's maps have distinct landmarks, areas are often circularly navigable, shortcuts are placed decently often, and the HUD map is fantastic, if a bit small. This game does qualify as a dungeon crawler, so it may outright be the most navigable dungeon crawler I have ever played by a massive margin. I do think it leads to a lack of horror from claustrophobia sometimes. I don't feel quite as trapped as I do in a lot of similar titles. Still, I do respect a game where I'm not still getting lost on my third playthrough. Sonar Shock also has no objective markers. I find this to be a net positive, as objectives are simple and clearly communicated to you, and codes or important location names are hammered in when they come up. Objectives are often A to B affairs, go somewhere and interact with a thing, which isn't necessarily impressive, but I at least respect that Sonar Shock doesn't get overly ambitious or tangled up in this regard. For better and for worse, it's not as cerebral nor as knotted up as its predecessor can be, partially invalidating my fursuit comment from the intro. I find some areas in System Shock 1 to still be tricky to quickly navigate after several playthroughs, whereas Sonar Shock hardly ever spurned such confusion after my first playthrough. It keeps that retro dungeon crawler vibe while also cutting out the genuinely psychotic design old dungeon crawlers often fell victim to. Once again, I propose that level designers in the 90s and early aughts were largely sadists who realized that level design was a novel way to torture people non-violently. Regardless, I do think the dread of being disoriented within the dungeon is part of the appeal of dungeon crawlers, but I'm fine with something that respects my time more too. Speaking of dungeons, there's only 5 levels in total, with the 5th one being a mildly variable linear gauntlet. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Sonar Shock is on the shorter side of things, with my blind playthrough clocking in at roughly 8 hours. It's very much quality over quantity, which I prefer. There's a good bit of content to each floor, and you can spend a while both looting and searching for secrets. I was still discovering new content on a couple speedy playthroughs I did for extra footage, and beyond the obvious aspects of combat and exploration, there's also a handful of side quests. They're usually fairly straightforward affairs that encourage you to explore off to the side areas. Sherlock Holmes quests especially are the most interesting on offer, even if I can't get over how weird it is that he's here. I tend to strongly dislike detective quests, but these are pretty quick and feel relatively thought out, even if you can just brute force them. Doing these quests is often worth it for the precious XP, microchips, and unique rewards they can reward you with. These rewards are nice, even if their value can depend on your build and whether or not you discovered a secret path to floor 4. Seriously, that invalidates a lot of side questing. On the topic of secrets, since I have a bit of an explorer's heart, much like First President Chris Columbus, Sonar Shock's exploration was very satisfying for me. It does well encouraging players to explore, especially if you're the hoarding type. Just about every room has loot hidden in it. There's tons of interactable filing cabinets and neuron-activating breakable boxes, and you have an inventory with infinite stacking and no need to organize or manage it. 2 weapon limit aside, of course. It's truly a klepto fantasy. It greatly helps that every item can be useful. I thought that the escape rope would only be useful for speedruns, yet it came in clutch when I was completely cornered once. Similarly, the instant killing disposable knives can be incredibly useful as a panic button, or when you need to fillet something, that too. I found myself actively seeking out these knives on all of my playthroughs because they're that useful. Pretty much every item in this game is worth looking out for, and since these items often come in small quantities, the fact that they often go a long way makes them a lot more precious. Though receiving 1 or 2 bullets from most pickups made me feel like I accidentally enabled a famine skull, still, this psychological sensation of resource scarcity goes a long way towards making your dumpster diving acquisitions significant. It made me want to hoard resources for tough encounters. Tough encounters that don't really come. Sonar Shock is on the easier side of things, with most enemies not being too threatening and there not really being any resource taxes until the end game. Even its boss type enemies never take more than a magazine to kill and aren't too hard to dodge otherwise. Heck, you can even safely one-shot some of the deadliest enemies if you know that they're sneak attacks. That's a weird esoteric mechanic that's just kind of there and never hinted at to the player. It's not like stealth is particularly viable since you get instantly detected if you can see more than 2 pixels of most most baddies. That aside, the game feels rather hesitant to throw big challenges or resource checks at you relative to most of its distant cousins. For all of my footage, I'm playing on the hardest difficulty, which feels like it would be the normal difficulty in most other similar games. I personally prefer games to be more relaxed and absurdly difficult or stressful, but I do strongly believe that this game would benefit from a harder difficulty option. Luckily, there is a solution of sorts, making your own difficulty. If you want the secret survival horror mode / hard mode, don't put any points into strength whatsoever, focus on guns but don't take free stuff, and opt into sanity but avoid significant faith investment. It's a far scarier, more intense playthrough, and I died in this playthrough more times than I died in my blind playthrough. It's an interesting way to experience the game again once you're a couple playthroughs in. It really pushes you to scavenge, make your shots count, utilize your environment and consumables, and keep mental track of damage taken. I thoroughly enjoyed this playthrough and would recommend it as a third or beyond playthrough. To go back a little bit, I do want to be fair to Sonar Shock's awkward difficulty curve. It doesn't have the most to work with most enemies charging you down for melee, maybe sporadically spewing out a projectile or hit scanning you. There's little bits of flair to enemies, like the radical claymation Cthulhu puppies having a radiation aura. Radiation otherwise doesn't hurt you, don't trust your lying Geiger counter, tour Chernobyl. Anyways, the late game enemies do have decent variety to their attacks and behaviors, so they spice things up a good bit. I like that human enemies can operate these incredibly goofy and awkward turret emplacements. They can also vent, which is something most AAA AI doesn't do. Don't let these rudiments of intelligence fool you though, this AI is still incredibly 90s. It may seem smart when they break destructible objects to get to you, but that does include explosive barrels. I learned that early and exploited it a lot. Under normal circumstances, I have a lot more to say about encounters, enemy design, and behaviors, but almost everything here is fairly archetypical and simple. Nothing bad, just a lot that will likely feel familiar. And the rest of it isn't worth squeezing a few more minutes of level design jargon out of. You're not here for me to describe every hallway and square room, right? I don't think you are, right? To awkwardly close off this section, I'm circling fairly far back to address the hacking mechanic, which opens up shortcuts and exclusive loot stashes. It's very rare to see other ways to bypass it, so if you see a keypad to hack, it's likely the only way through. Regardless, I despise the hacking minigame. It's a version of Pong that's an unfortunate mix of being slow-paced, random, and inherently unfun. It's not hard, it's just that there's no strategy here beyond luck and a bit of perseverance. Persevering to not die from the tedium of this minigame. Losing happens when the player gives up and winning happens when the AI gives up, making it feel incredibly hollow either way. A lot could be fixed by simply having the balls start off way faster, though I might also suggest having the events sway things more wildly, perhaps with the AI being able to directly inflict negative events on the player, and vice versa. Pong a la Twinkle Star Sprites. Honestly, the worst part of all of this is the missed opportunity to make it Tetris. It ties in with the Soviet mind control themes after all. Thank you, obscure Christian game review website, for brainrotting us all on this fine day. It's also a shame that hacking tapers off harder than any other skill in the game. I believe there are only 2 doors in the game that require a hacking of 5, though I could have waltzed past another. One of these has a negant behind them, so as far as I'm aware, the only incentive in maxing out hacking is acquiring the endgame pistol early. The game gives very few opportunities to acquire endgame weapons early, so this is notable. Aside from this one negant, most of them are crammed into the latter portion of level 4, or gated behind enough bottles of vodka to make a Russian start thinking about the potential hangover. So beyond that negant, the incentives to max out hacking are outright not there. Even 3 points in hacking feels dubiously useful. Hacking is certainly among the weaker links in the skill system. Hacking is lacking, I should say. The push to invest points in it should have been more significant than the addition of a random chance to just instantly win. Something you can guarantee from the get-go by using a spike. The spikes are a welcome addition in the wrong way, because they feel like a bit of self-awareness that this minigame is subpar. They instantly skip the minigame very quickly, zero risk, and they're quite common as well. I think there may genuinely be an equal number of spikes and keypads throughout the campaign. I won't complain, but it's definitely avant-garde design. Speaking of avant-garde, I put way too much effort into this upcoming bit and didn't want to waste it, so you're gonna be subject to this. Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you get your balls stuck in my Pong paddle vice grip trap. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal hacking minigame? But yeah, hacking sucks. Now, to jump off from that bit of madness, I need to finally address another bit of madness. It's something I'm specifically dedicating a brief section to because I know someone would really want to know the answer to this question. Is Sonar Shock an immersive sim? After all, it takes heavy inspiration from System Shock, the game that is almost universally pointed to as the birthplace of the genre. This is an unfortunate can of worms that I don't want to dwell on for too long because it could probably add 10 minutes to this video's runtime. So, being honest, I don't think it is. Don't let the Steam tags easily convince you otherwise. Power Washing Simulator is tagged as an immersive sim too. You think the homunculi who tag games on Steam know what the genre is? Sonar Shock is light on significant forms of interactivity and emergent gameplay. You sporadically get to employ your own problem-solving methods to reach your objectives, but a mild degree of open-endedness alone does not an immersive sim make. Like I said, you see, a hacking keypad is almost universally the only way through. Sure, with investment and faith, you can ask Jesus to reduce the difficulty of keypads, but you still have to hack it. Even in the most mediocre immersive sims, you would have a ton of other ways past an obstructive door. Maybe it can be bypassed through lockpicking, blowing it open, shooting it open, stacking boxes, taking another path, stacking boxes, the list goes on. I never felt like I had a multitude of genuinely different ways of dealing with a simple problem in Sonar Shock. I say you get to utilize your own problem-solving methods, but that's a half joke. Your greatest means of problem-solving is bullets, with your greatest means of personal expression being which specific flavor of bullets you want to use. There's a respectable number of decently realized guns, sure, yet you're not getting especially creative with these. All of your guns are fairly standard shoot-straight firearms. Gimmick weapons are gimmicks in presentation only and still shoot good old hurdy bullets. Beyond that, the game seems to barely account for unconventional playstyles like stealth, and most areas, even significant encounters and arenas, have at most 2 points of entry. There's not much player input in how encounters play out, especially thanks to the rudimentary AI and encounter design. All characters will be geared towards brute forcing their way through obstacles, or, if you're feeling a little quirky, by running past them. The only real problem guns and melee weapons can't solve is keypads, because this so-called FPS-RPG couldn't bother, say, offering crafty players an alternative path. High-strength characters a way to brute force open a door, or hackers the opportunity to hack the door because unhackable doors are arbitrarily a thing. It means the way you bypass this obstacle will be about the same on every playthrough. This is something more characteristic of linear games and im-sims, and a common trend in Sonar Shock. It means things that are intuitively very im-simmy don't work out, like trying to blow open a locked door using explosives. Your greatest interactions with the world are your ability to open doors, throw boxes, and flush toilets. Elements of emergent gameplay are light at best, mostly being centered around the moments where you decide to whip out a fire extinguisher to help extinguish a bad guy's life. You can't be set on fire or anything like that, so it's not like you can use the fire extinguisher for anything else. All of the most interesting things you're able to do involve just moving one of 3 object types around. Sonar Shock is very mechanically simple in this regard. The most emergent thing I was ever able to do was make enemies blow themselves up on explosive barrels. Funny, but rather uninvolved. They just do it to themselves sometimes, the eldritch goofballs. Now, Half-Life 2 is a linear first-person shooter that effectively nobody would call an immersive sim. There's very little argumentation there. And yet its gravity gun alone opens way more doors for player inventiveness than all of the mechanics in Sonar Shock combined. That comment sounds pretty brutal. It would be more scathing if Sonar Shock itself was actually officially marketed as an immersive sim. That's just what Steam tags loudly proclaim. Its store page only notes that it is inspired by immersive RPGs, which I think is a bit different. Put this way, I do understand it. Sonar Shock doesn't seem to consider itself one of those games, it just takes inspiration from their design and direction. Ultimately, I believe it's too mechanically light to genuinely be an immersive sim. This not only goes for Sonar Shock, but the original System Shock as well. This isn't even to bash the two of these games, I just don't think the immersive sim title is an adequate fit for either of them. It's a problem with both the relative ambiguity of the genre and the simplicity of the im-sim elements present in these two games. They just lack the meat on the bones that I would expect from a game in the genre. Of course, I'm not the end-all be-all authority on this matter. I've just played a lot of immersive sims and I used to be pretty obsessed with them, so I feel I have a more authoritative horse in this race than average. Still, whether or not they fit into an infamously dubiously defined genre will probably remain up for debate. I mean, half of all im-sim discussion is arguing what is and isn't an im-sim anyways. It's par for the course, and Sonar Shock likely won't be an exception to that discourse. However, let me practically apply an immersive sim community in joke. There's no stacking boxes here, thus it's not an immersive sim. Actually, there is a single point where you can stack boxes, but it's pain, and also the only way through. I did find a clever way to subvert half of it though, so I guess that's the closest you'll get to a true im-sim moment. I guess on the general topic of genres Sonar Shock ambiguously occupies, I should address whether or not it's survival horror. It's another loosely defined genre, and I've seen the term used fairly liberally, much like with immersive sim. I think survival horror asks for a certain degree of vulnerability, where the biggest advantages you have over your enemies are your wits, slowly accumulating resources, and leg muscles. Sonar Shock technically has all three of those, especially the leg musculature, but they don't feel as prevalent as they would be in a full-fledged survival horror title. You can pretty reasonably wipe out every living thing you see and have plenty of resources to spare. Sure, these resources are limited, yet they go decently far and are easy to conserve and accumulate. Even my blind playthrough concluded with more bullets, healing items, and save discs than I knew what to do with. It was to the point where I intentionally picked fights with an enemy type capable of one-shotting me because they're XP pinatas, living bottles o' enchantin'. You're pushed away from choosing your battles and acting evasively. Running is possible, but it's hardly the best choice in a game where everything dangerous is either hit scan or capable of firing out homing projectiles. And stealth effectively only exists as a stealth archer damage multiplier. The sneak attacks feel like a leftover of a severely underbaked, unimplemented stealth system. Honestly, saying the stealth is underbaked is an understatement. It's the dry ingredients of the dough with a bit of whipped cream on top. And even though you are technically hindered by the tank controls, I feel like I've never played a game where it's less of an issue. It's a weakness that is never really exploited. You're hardly ever put in situations that ask for quick turning or tight maneuvering, and you can typically idly corner fight just fine, especially if your specialty is whacking monsters. I shouldn't be complaining that I feel in control of my character, but tank controls are usually intended to take a bit of agency and maneuverability from the player. It usually goes a long way in making everything more intense and involved, yet that doesn't really feel like the case with Sonar Shock. And I've already mentioned that the combat is fairly easy and briefly mentioned that I rarely felt boxed in. Tension usually only came from rare ambushes, sanity events, good atmosphere from time to time, and that feeling that I hadn't saved in a while. Half of those things are player controlled and thus easily fixed, like popping cigarettes for sanity or daringly using one of the 30 3D printed save icons in your inventory. There is tension here, but the experience ultimately feels like an action horror title more than anything else. So yeah, I'd say Sonar Shock is action horror rather than survival horror. It has a couple elements of the formula, but it doesn't go headlong into them and ultimately encourages gunning down every monster in sight above all else. It doesn't invalidate the game or anything, and you can certainly see the genre influences in there, but Sonar Shock isn't an immersive sim, nor is it survival horror. I admit I can be weirdly nitpicky with genres and definitions. Still, I feel fairly confident in my judgment. Either this game is misinterpreted, or immersive sim and survival horror fans are simply very thirsty for more titles to add to their piles. It bothers me to an extent, though I guess I understand. I'm open to hearing counter-arguments to anything I've said in this section, because discourse is valuable when talking about mildly abstract, innocuous concepts like this. Regardless, this is the end of my analysis. It's time to give a quick summary and hand out some accolades. We're into concluding thoughts now. I plan on keeping this section rather short this time around. Overall, I really liked Sonar Shock. It hit in a lot of the right places for me. It's got chunky guns, a cool aesthetic, plenty of unique ideas, and a rather cerebral feel, if that means anything to you. Sonar Shock definitely respects the player's intelligence more than the average FPS. The controls and HUD design, lack of objective markers, mild resource management, large rewards for exploring, and heavy incentives to outwit or ambush enemies all make the game feel more engaging than average. Even though I don't think it's an immersive sim, I can definitely see the design influences here. I'd also reiterate that I don't believe it fits the bill of survival horror, though relative to immersive sims, that's a genre I'm far less discerning with. That I believe Sonar Shock doesn't arbitrarily fall into either of these categories doesn't make it bad or disappointing, not at all, just tricky to categorize. It's a blend of a lot of things and a fairly enjoyable blend overall. Sonar Shock is a recommendation from me, with the most significant caveats, barring the genre confusion, being the controls, short runtime, and awkward sanity mechanics. Oh, and the performance dips, though I'm holding out hope that that will be fixed in time. Despite those mostly rather mild issues, Sonar Shock satiated a good few specific cravings I had well. mostly in a way that it feels like an alternative indie take on the original System Shock. It did also satisfy my random desire for both aquatic horror and Soviet-flavored horror. You know, maybe I also wanted another You Are Empty or another Singularity, just without the unstoppable minigun-toting time demigod aspect. Not always in the mood for that. Regardless, Sonar Shock was a great impulse buy. My obscure game sense didn't screw me over this time. How quaint, because it does that a lot. I mean, you see some of the trash I've covered. This is outright one of the best games I've touched on for this channel, and if it sounds like your cup of tea at all, just buy it and play it. It's definitely worth it. $8 is an extremely solid price for what you get, especially if you decide to replay the game to try different builds, utilize new weapons, and see both endings. I sunk more time and playthroughs into this game than average. It's great, and I can't find any further ways to hammer in that I recommend this game. So, without any further ado, I'll hand out some accolades. Indie Certified. Sonar Shock defied a lot of my expectations, both in good ways and bad ways. The clever things it pulls are truly clever, whereas there's also just things that blow my mind from a game design or writing perspective. The Sanity mechanic especially is fascinating. It feels like somehow more effort and thought went into Sanity. The potential lack of incentive to engage with it and the harsh low Sanity effects make it this awkward mix of entertaining and unfair, and that's not even mentioning the fact that you can skip out on it. Have you ever heard of a game casually letting you decide, nah, I don't want to deal with this significant mechanic, and then just letting you completely skip it with no side effects? It's oddball design like this that makes Sonar Shock a uniquely indie game, and I mean that as a lightly backhanded compliment. It truly feels like I'm in someone else's world, their hodgepodge of things that sounded fun, interesting, or cool to them. It gives Sonar Shock this rare charm that I find extremely appealing, and it's one of the big appeals to indie games in general, at least for me. It's the same vibe I got from Fractal Block World, albeit less fever dreamish. I love this breed of indie game charm, and Sonar Shock has it in spades. Next up, System Shock 1, 2. For numerous reasons, it's been incredibly difficult to not compare Sonar Shock to its closest relative, System Shock 1. I promise I tried not to make comparisons in my initial draft of the script. I didn't try hard, but I tried. Sonar Shock is very interesting for taking after many of the evolutionary dead ends of System Shock 1. Dead ends like the complex real-time menu HUD and the hybrid point-and-click action FPS gameplay, which are not bad ideas, they simply didn't catch on. Sonar Shock elaborates on its predecessor in certain ways, like the weapon reloading mechanics, and contributes new ideas such as the Sanity system. It is missing things with less involved point-and-click elements, no puzzles, and no cyberspace equivalent. Still, Sonar Shock almost feels like an official spin-off or successor to 1994's System Shock in terms of gameplay and design. I think other titles carry on the general spirit of System Shock better, especially in terms of writing and theming, but Sonar Shock carries over the vibe while still being its own thing. I'd say Sonar Shock is a worthy addition to the System Shock family tree. It's a good torch to try carrying, and I think it's got the right spirit. And the final accolade. It's not really an immersive sim, pushes up glasses. It's clearly inspired by immersive sims and borrows a handful of ideas, but the genre is so poorly defined and people apply the term so liberally that it muddies the waters and, you get what I mean. I went into this game expecting a full-fledged immersive sim and felt I didn't get that. I worried that having the wrong expectations could turn people off an otherwise enjoyable title. Sonar Shock here is an RPG FPS dungeon crawler. Go in with that knowledge and treat it as such. It's still a solid game and a worthwhile experience even if it doesn't tick a bunch of checkboxes that are so abstract that they make a later Picasso painting look like a still life. Today's moral is, don't trust Steam community tags, they're god-awful. Anyways, that's all for today's episode. Thanks to those who engaged with my content and my Patreons. Thank you, Banana, my current sole Patreon, for sticking with me in spite of my dog water upload schedule. Since I rarely upload, the all notifications option on that bell should be fairly succulent and delectable. I'll be up front for once and say I do have multiple plans for future videos, with the next long format video review being about Deus Ex Invisible War. Interesting game. For now, I'll just say it's worse than I expected. I want to make a short follow-up video on Fractal Block World, and I have a few shorter videos in early production. Until next time, just remember that the exhibition is haunted. Have a good one.